Hey everyone. So, got a couple of minutes in between online classes. Thought I'd answer a question that has popped up a few times recently, and people have asked for some advice, so I'm going to give whatever advice I can. And this is to do with situational awareness. So, something that happens quite often, and I remember the same thing happened to me when I started training extensively in self-defense and have really started working on my situational awareness, was that I felt that I was being paranoid all the time. Like I was hyper aware and I was, seeing dangers and shadows and whatever it was. And that is definitely something that can happen, but also something that needs to be managed because you don't want to walk around paranoid or stressed all the time, right? It leads to adrenal fatigue and it leads to stress and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, the first thing I'd like to say is if you are working on your situational awareness, first of all, just know that it is normal to go through that phase of all of a sudden being a little bit hyper aware. And that's a good sign. It means you're thinking and applying what it is that you're actually learning about. So that's a good thing. What we then need to do is train ourselves to the point where it's no longer an issue and it doesn't get you adrenalized and you only respond to the right stimuli. Now, so the first thing is just confirming this is actually a good sign that you're going through this. Let me draw a really good example. If you want to think of the last time you bought a new car, chances are you would have done a little bit of market research, figured out what car it is that you want, and when you've decided on the car, as you're driving down the road in the days or weeks before buying that car, chances are you would have seen that make and model everywhere, even though you probably would have never noticed it before. Okay, and the same thing happens probably in the few days or weeks after you bought your car. All of a sudden you would see that make and model everywhere. So what happened there was you have tuned your consciousness or your awareness to a specific object. In this case, it's a car. And all of a sudden you see it everywhere because you're tuned into it. The same thing happens with situational awareness. So let's talk a little bit about the way that our brain processes information and how we make sense of what we see and how we give meaning to what we see. So our brain has two operating systems. Okay, the first one is what we call system one, and that is the autonomous, instinctive, subconscious process system. 95% of the decisions that we make are based on system one. Okay, most of the time when you get that gut feeling that something is wrong, that's because system one has picked up on something that your conscious mind, which is system two, which I'll get to in a minute, hasn't picked up yet. Okay, so system one is, like I said, subconscious, instinctive, emotional, and those are the decisions that we make 95% of the time. System two, on the other hand, is our rational, conscious thought processes. This is takes a lot more effort to process. We only use this system for about 5% of the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. So the question then becomes, how do we decide which system to use? Well, we don't. There is a part in our brain called the reticular activating system, or the RAS for short, and that is a little filter that filters the information that comes from your senses and decides which actions need to be handled by system one and which need to be handled by system two. Now, the RAS makes those decisions based on only two principles. What am I interested in? And what is relevant to our discussion, what has the potential to harm me? Now, it's important that we mention that this is what has the perceived potential to harm me, because it all based on our own perceptions. So the way the RAS learns how to filter information is based on our experiences and biases. Okay, so as we grow up, we have our life experiences, and that shapes what we pay attention to and what we doesn't. We have certain inbuilt biases that we gravitate towards or affect our thinking, and the RAS takes that into account as well. Now, what is going on in terms of the processes that you're talking about when you become paranoid is that all of a sudden system two is active all the time because you're consciously paying attention to things that you haven't paid attention to before. So what you're actually doing there is training your RAS to pay attention to different things. Now, a couple of things happen from that. Number one is that system two takes a lot of effort, right? We can only focus on a very, very small number of things at any given time consciously, and those take a tremendous amount of mental power and energy, which is why we can't do it for very, very long. Okay. Now, to start with, it would be very, very draining to do that. The good news is, what we can do is actually train our RAS and System 1 to pay attention to the right things within the right context. Okay, now this can be done quite easily. So in order to start training that, what you need to do is actually start thinking about how to identify potential risks and hazards in your environment. So for example, if you go into a cafe, you can look at where are the entries and exit points, if there are any defensive objects that you can use, where the CCTV cameras are placed, if there are any, where you sit and the people who are coming in, how are they behaving, is there anything out of the ordinary, all that kind of stuff. To start with, you will have to consciously do it because you haven't trained to do that yet. Now, this process should take you about 30 seconds. Walk into a place, have a quick look around, scan, identify things, do it that way. If you do that at 30-second blocks, so you do 3 30-second blocks a day, right? And you do that for about a month, you'll find that that process becomes almost entirely subconscious. In other words, you have transferred that process from System 2 to System 1, and now it doesn't take as much effort. It is done subconsciously, and you're a lot less stressed about it because it's something that's done automatically. What will happen then is, if you've done it correctly, is you'll only pay attention to those things that are out of the ordinary instead of being hyper aware of everything all of the time. Okay, so that is really the way that we train that. Now, this is closely tied to intuition. Intuition is essentially when System 1 picks up something that System 2 hasn't yet, or hasn't been filtered correctly to that system. So, if in doubt, listen to your intuition, all right? Better safe than sorry. And generally, there's 2 things that we can trust your intuition will always do. It's always in response to something, and it always has your best interest or survival at heart. So, and I'm quoting Gavin the Becker, there you go, I said that there. So if your intuition is firing up, trust it. Hopefully, if you've trained it correctly, then it should become a lot less stressful for you, and you'll become a lot more proficient at doing it, and you'll do it without thinking about it, okay? Now, the last part that I'd like to add is that, just going back to the start, it is important to recognize that it is normal to go through that phase. So as you become, when you're unaware, you're blissfully unaware, you don't know what you don't know. As you start knowing and you pay attention, all of a sudden your awareness peaks and you become hyper aware. After time, you'll find you actually drop down and your awareness will only spike when it needs to, okay? So trust in your training, 30-second blocks, 3 times a day for about a month, and you'll find that process becomes automatic. Every so often, it is good to go through a conscious process of doing that. So there you go, guys, a little bit of help about making sure that you manage your adrenaline with situational awareness.